The water had not been still for 3 days. Maria Espinosa lay flat on her back beneath the surface of the southern Iraqi marshes, breathing through a hollow reed no thicker than a grown man's finger, her eyes just barely above the waterline, staring up at a sky the color of old bone. The sun was not yet up, but the darkness had that particular quality it gets in the last hour before dawn. Not fully black anymore, but not offering any real light either. Just a softer darkness that was almost worse, because it let you see the shapes of things without being sure what the shapes were. Every few seconds she blinked, slowly and deliberately, the way a crocodile blinks. She had learned to blink that slowly over 11 days in this water. She had learned a great many things in 11 days. The blinking was one of the smaller ones. The reeds around her were dense and tall, pale gold even in the dark, and they moved in the light wind with a sound like paper being folded, soft and constant. She was part of that movement now. She had been out here long enough that her mind had stopped separating her from the water and the reeds and the mud beneath her. She was not a person hiding in a marsh. She was the marsh. She occupied it the way water occupied it, without beginning or edge, without any visible sign that she was there at all. 40 meters to the east, a patrol was moving along the bank. She heard them before she could see them, boots pressing into soft mud, each step a small wet compression. The clink of a metal rifle sling against the edge of a magazine, a man clearing his throat, dry and quiet, the sound of someone who had been awake since before midnight, and whose body was beginning to register the fact. She counted the sounds the way her instructor at the Naval Dive School in Virginia had taught her to count them. 7 years ago, in a cold training pool that smelled of chlorine and institutional ambition, and the specific exhaustion of being pushed far past what you thought you could do. 4. Count what you hear before you trust what you see. Count it once and then count it again. She counted 5. Then she counted again, and got 6. The patrol was not moving fast. That was the part that kept her heart from settling. A fast patrol was a patrol on a fixed route, moving from checkpoint to checkpoint without particular interest in what lay between. A fast patrol did its job in a broad and general way. A slow patrol was a patrol that was looking for something. And if they were looking for something out here, in this specific stretch of the Al-Hamar marshes, on this specific dark morning, then someone had given them a reason to look. She had been thinking about that reason for the past 2 days, turning it over in her mind while she lay in the water and counted mines and logged the coordinates in her notebook, and waited for the nights when it was dark enough to move. Maria Espinosa was a Navy rescue diver by training, though that description had stopped covering the full extent of her actual duties sometime around her 3rd deployment, when the scope of what she was asked to do had quietly expanded into territories that had no clean official name. Her paperwork described her as an asset attached to a maritime intelligence unit operating in support of coalition forces in southern Iraq. What that meant in practical terms was that she went into places where boats could not navigate and radio signals could not reach reliably, and satellite imaging produced only ambiguous shapes in green and brown water, where the actual information was hiding 2 feet below the surface. She went in alone. She came out alone. That was the design. The mission had been described at the briefing as manageable, which was the word the briefing officer had used, and which was the word Maria had heard used to describe many things that turned out to be considerably more complicated than manageable when you were actually in them. She was to move through a stretch of marsh corridor running between the Euphrates River and a secondary waterway that did not yet appear on any coalition map under an agreed name. The corridor was 18 kilometers long. She was to locate and precisely mark the positions of any underwater mines placed in the water lanes used by coalition supply convoys. She was to track enemy patrol patterns and document any changes in frequency or formation. She was to remain undetected throughout, for a period not exceeding 14 days. At the end of the 14 days, she was to exit at a designated point and make contact with an extraction team. She was on day 11. In those 11 days, she had identified and marked 23 mines. She had watched enemy fighters block 3 different coalition supply convoys by using a combination of submerged debris and careful timing. The fighters would seal a primary water channel, wait for the convoy to attempt a navigation around the blockage, and then discover that the alternative channels had also been sealed. She had watched this happen from 30 meters away, lying flat in the water, breathing through her reed, making notes in the waterproof notebook sealed against her ribs. 23 mines, 3 blocked convoys, 6 additional ordnance sites she had located beyond her original brief, because they were there, and she had the notebook and the pencil. The notebook was waterproof, sealed inside 3 heavy layers of plastic, pressed flat beneath her wetsuit against her left ribcage. It was the size of a deck of playing cards. She had written everything in a personal shorthand that she had developed over years of this kind of work, a system of symbols and abbreviations that compressed a great deal of information into a very small space, and that no one else alive could decode with certainty. If something happened to her, the data went with her. That was the design as well. That was also the part of the plan that required everything else to not go wrong in a particular way. The boots stopped. She stopped breathing. She did not do it as a figure of speech. She physically stopped pulling air through the reed, and held what was already in her lungs, and let every muscle in her body go to a state of complete and deliberate stillness. Her face was just above the waterline. Her hands were resting in the mud 2 feet below her. Her eyes were fixed on the pale shape of the sky above the reeds, and she did not move them. A voice, but male, speaking in short, flat sentences. She did not have enough Arabic to catch all of it cleanly, but she caught enough. The word for reeds, the word for check or examine, another word that she translated roughly as move along the edge, and underneath those words, cutting through them, the particular shift in posture that a person makes when they have stopped, because something has caught their attention, and they are deciding whether it is worth investigating. A boot came down into the water. She let her eyes move right without turning her head. She could see the lower half of a figure 6 meters away, standing in the shallow water at the edge of the channel, pushing reeds aside with one hand, and holding a rifle elevated with the other. The figure was moving in her direction, but not toward her specifically. It was moving toward all of it, toward the general possibility of something being where something should not be, and the distance between that and moving toward her specifically was 6 meters and a lot of mud, and 11 days of algae and marsh sediment that had settled into every surface of her wetsuit, and her skin, and her hair, and had made her, she hoped, look like something that had always been there, and belonged there. She had 2 options. She had been reducing things to 2 options in critical moments for her entire adult life. Not because 2 was always the real number, but because 2 was a manageable number, and in a moment that required a decision, manageable was what you needed. She could stay completely still, and let the mud and the low light and the reeds do what they had been doing for 11 days. Or she could back slowly away through the water, putting distance between herself and the approaching figure, betting that the sound of her movement would blend with the sound of his. She had been trained for exactly this choice, and the training said, stay. A moving person makes a decision and announces it. A still person offers nothing. She stayed. The figure worked through the water for what her internal clock told her was around 90 seconds. He stopped twice. The second time he stopped, she could see the grain of the fabric of his sleeve, close enough that if the light had been better, she could have described the color. She looked at the fabric and thought, in the calm and slightly distant way that very focused people think in very dangerous moments, that she had probably done most of what she was going to do in this lifetime, and that the thing pressed flat against her ribs was worth something, even if she was not going to be the one who got it out. Then something called him back. A voice from the south bank, one of his colleagues, signaling something, whatever it was enough. The figure turned, stepped back out of the water, and the patrol kept moving east, at the same deliberate pace it had been keeping. Maria Espinosa breathed. She lay in the water and counted slowly to 300, letting each number settle before moving to the next one, letting her heart rate find its way back down to something she recognized. Then she moved west, pressing through the reeds with her forearms low and flat, covering the sound with her own breathing, moving until she was far enough from where the patrol had been that she could allow herself to stop. She needed to rest. She had been awake for 31 hours straight, and the body eventually stops being a matter of will and becomes a matter of simple physical arithmetic, and the arithmetic was telling her clearly that she was close to the edge of what she could do without sleep. She found a place in the reeds where the root system had matted into a platform just below the surface, firm enough to hold her flat without sinking. She lay on it, face up, the sky showing pale above the reeds, and she ran the inventory she ran every few hours. 3 days of compressed food, 2 spare reeds, 1 waterproof flashlight with 4 hours of battery life at full output, the notebook, a small compass, a folding knife she had not opened since day 1. 2 days before the extraction window. The window was narrow, 2 hours long, at a specific point on the eastern margin of the marsh, where a small boat could come in close enough for her to reach it. If she missed it, the next one was 4 days out. 4 days was a long time, for a lot of reasons, including the fact that a story was moving through the communities along this waterway. A story that had been moving for most of the 11 days she had been in this marsh. A story about something in the water that was not supposed to be in the water. She had heard the beginning of that story before she entered the marsh. 2 men outside a building at the edge of a village, talking in the early evening, and one of them describing something he had heard from someone else. A figure in the reeds. Something that moved at night without making noise. Something that was visible and then not visible. The word he had used translated as, the one who moves like water, or sometimes as the woman of the reeds. The locals had different versions. Some called her a ghost. Some called her something closer to a spirit that lived in the marsh. Some called her a mermaid. She had thought it was darkly funny at the time. It was less funny after 11 days, because a story that was moving through a community was a story that could reach the wrong people, and wrong people with a story and coordinates were exactly what a slow patrol moving through the reeds before dawn looked like. She looked at the sky through the reeds, pale copper now, the sun coming up whether she was ready or not. She thought about the notebook, 23 mines, 3 blocked convoys, an 18-kilometer corridor that would open inside 72 hours of the data being delivered, if the data reached the engineering team intact. On the other side of that corridor, in towns she had only ever seen on maps, people were waiting for things that had been stopped from reaching them for 3 weeks. Medicine, food, water filtration units, the ordinary materials of a life that could not be maintained without them. That was the point. Not the water or the mud or the 31 sleepless hours. The point was on the other side of the corridor, and the notebook pressed flat against her ribs was the mechanism that connected where she was to where the point was. She pulled herself off the route platform and back into the water. 2 days was enough. It had to be. 40 kilometers north of where Maria was lying in the water, inside a forward operating base that smelled of diesel exhaust and stale coffee, and the particular institutional flatness that comes from air processed through too many filters over too many weeks. Corporal Owen Price was staring at a piece of paper that did not make sense. Owen was 24 years old. He was from Dayton, Ohio, and he had the kind of face that consistently made people underestimate him, which was a round, open, slightly unfinished face that belonged on a college sophomore rather than an intelligence analyst, and which had occasionally been useful to him for exactly that reason. He had been working in signals intelligence for 2.5 years. His job, in its most basic description, was to sit in a tent full of radio equipment and listen to frequencies and write down the things he heard and then figure out, as systematically as he could, whether the things he had written down mattered. He was very good at this. He was the kind of person who noticed patterns without consciously deciding to look for them, the way some people can hear a melody once and reproduce it exactly without effort, without being able to explain how they did it. The piece of paper in front of him was a printed transcript of a fragmentary radio intercept that had come in 6 hours earlier. It had been flagged as low priority by the automated processing system, which worked by matching keywords against a running database and assigning each intercept a confidence score based on how closely the content matched known categories of interest. This particular intercept had scored at the very bottom of the scale, which meant it had been printed out and placed in a stack of other low-priority items to be reviewed whenever someone had time. No one had had time. Owen was reviewing it now because he was waiting for the coffee to finish brewing, and the transcript was the top item on the nearest stack. It was 3 partial sentences and 2 numbers. The Arabic was fragmentary in a way that suggested either a failing radio, a moving operator, or a signal caught at the absolute edge of its usable range. The translation notes below the Arabic were tentative in places and openly uncertain in others. As a piece of intelligence, it was thin, The automated system had been correct to flag it low. But the two numbers were clear. They were precise, unambiguous, fully transmitted. They were coordinates. Owen looked at them for a second time. Something in the back of his mind was making the quiet sound that things made back there when they connected to something else he had already seen. He did not ignore that sound. He had learned not to ignore it. He went to his logbook, which he kept in a binder on the left side of his desk, organized chronologically, every entry dated and time-stamped. He had an excellent memory for what he had written down, and a somewhat less reliable memory for what he had merely read or heard without writing, which was one of the reasons he wrote everything down. He found the reference in under 4 minutes, a log entry from 6 days earlier, made while processing an outgoing communication that had referenced a maritime intelligence asset operating in the Al Hamar Marsh sector. The communication had used a grid reference, not a name, not a unit designation, just a grid reference and an authorization code. The grid reference matched the coordinates in the transcript. Owen sat back and looked at the wall for a moment. In the marsh at those coordinates, someone was operating. Coalition asset or allied asset, actively in the field, and in the intercepted transmission sent earlier that morning, 2 numbers had come through clearly on an enemy-controlled frequency. 2 numbers that placed that same location. He wrote 3 words in pencil at the top of the transcript. Asset may be compromised. Then he stood up and walked quickly down the center aisle of the tent, toward the section where Lieutenant Colonel Gary Fenton had his office, which was a military term for a space roughly the size of a large closet, divided from the rest of the tent by a plywood partition and a curtain that was not quite long enough. Fenton was 51 years old and had been in the Army since he was 19. He had the particular quality that long service either produces or eliminates, which was the ability to process unexpected information without immediately reacting to it. He read things completely before he responded to them. He had spent 32 years watching people react to the first sentence of a report before reading the last one, and the habit had cost them, in his observation, at a consistent rate, and he was not that kind of person. He read the transcript. He read Owen's log entry from 6 days earlier. He looked at the coordinates, and then at the map on the wall to his left, where the Al Hamar sector was marked with the standard symbology for an active intelligence operation. He said nothing for approximately 20 seconds. When did this come in? 6 hours ago, sir. Low priority flag. No one had looked at it. Another pause. Fenton's eyes were still on the map. Extraction window for that sector? 2 days out, sir. First available contact is 48 hours from now. Who knows about this? Only us, sir. I came directly here. Fenton set the transcript on the desk beside the log entry. He looked at both of them together for a moment, the way you look at 2 things when you are working out whether they belong in the same category. Get me Sergeant Weaver, he said. Owen did not know the name Weaver. He found the man in 20 minutes by walking through the base and asking. Daniel Weaver was sitting on the ground beside a vehicle at the western edge of the vehicle pool, eating from a pouch of food, looking at nothing in particular, with the steady, unrevealing expression of a man who was either thinking intensely or thinking about nothing at all, and who gave no external indication of which it was. He was 31 years old, medium height, medium build, with light brown hair that was probably a few weeks past regulation length, and a way of holding his body that looked relaxed from a distance and was not relaxed at all from a shorter distance. He had been a Navy SEAL for 8 years, a sniper for 6 of those years. He read the message from Fenton without standing. Then he stood, set the food pouch carefully on the running board of the vehicle, as if he intended to return to it, and followed Owen back to the intelligence section, without asking any questions. He read the transcript standing up, and he read the log entry. He looked at the map for a long time, studying the terrain between the base and the coordinates, which was not difficult terrain in terms of elevation, but was difficult in terms of access. Water, reed beds, soft ground, no roads within 3 kilometers of the target sector. What's the surface between here and those coordinates? He said. Owen showed him the topographic overlay. Weaver studied it. I need transport to this point, he said, placing his finger on a spot on the map, roughly 3 kilometers from the coordinates, where a rough track ran within range of the marsh edge. Foot from there. I estimate 3 hours, maybe a little more depending on the ground. You would be going in without authorization to engage, Fenton said. He was standing in the doorway of his office, watching. Weaver looked at him directly. Yes, sir, that's correct. Fenton held the look for a moment. Then he looked back at the map, then at the transcript. The silence in the room was the kind of silence that has a decision inside it. Get him the vehicle, Fenton said. That was the entire conversation. While Weaver was being given the vehicle, and Owen was watching the vehicle leave the base in the direction of the southern track, a man named Abbas was standing at a window of his home, near the edge of the marsh. He was 43 years old. He had been fishing the Alhamar marshes since he was 11, which meant he had been fishing them for 32 years, and knew them in the way that a long familiarity with a specific piece of ground produces, which is without needing to think about it, without checking his knowledge against anything external. He knew where the channels ran, and where the mud got soft and where the birds gathered in the early morning, and what those gatherings meant about the water below them. He had been hearing the story of the water woman for almost 2 weeks now. The story had started at the far eastern end of the community, carried by a man who fished the outer channels, and who had seen something he could not fully explain, something moving in the reeds at night, something that made almost no sound, a shape that was visible for a moment and then was not visible, the way a fish surfaces and then is gone, except that this was not a fish. The shape was wrong for a fish. It was too long, too deliberate, too much like a person to be anything in the water except a person. The story moved the way stories moved in places where people were close together, and the outside world was not close, which was quickly, and with embellishment. By the time it reached Abbas, the water woman had become a figure of legend who came and went with the tides, who helped the marsh fishermen find fish in dry seasons, who was somehow connected to the stoppage of the convoys that had not come through in over 3 weeks. None of those details were accurate. Abbas knew that, but he also knew that the core of the story, the moving shape in the reeds, was real, because too many different people had described the same core without knowing the others were describing it. That morning, he had watched a patrol move east along the bank. 8 men, spread wider than normal, moving slowly, not the regular patrol route, and a different configuration, as if someone had briefed them differently, told them to spread out and look at the reed beds more carefully than they usually did. He stayed at the window until the patrol was out of sight. Then he thought about the water woman for a while longer, wherever she was, and hoped with the simple directness of a man who had no way to help, and knew it that she was somewhere the patrol was not going to find. The convoy had not come through in 23 days. His youngest son had a chest condition that needed medicine, that was in that convoy somewhere, in a truck that had been sitting waiting to move for 3 weeks. His neighbor's family was getting their water from a source that was not clean, because the filtration equipment they needed was also in the convoy. He did not know the details of why the convoy had not come. He knew that the marsh was part of the reason, in a way he could not fully explain. He went back to his fishing because the fish did not wait, and the children needed to eat. Some things remain true no matter what else is happening around them. Back at the forward operating base, Owen Price filed the intercept properly, and updated his log, and then sat at his desk, and felt the particular low-grade unease of a person who has done everything they can do, and who now has to wait to find out whether it was enough. He had done his job. He had noticed the pattern. He had brought it to the right person in time for something to be done about it. Whether something was being done about it was not visible to him from here. He thought about the coordinates on the transcript. Whoever was at those coordinates had been out there for some number of days, doing something that required them to be there. He did not have the clearance to know the specifics of the operation. He knew only what the log entry told him, which was that someone in that sector was doing intelligence work, and that the enemy frequency had just broadcast their approximate location. He thought about what it would be like to be in that location right now. He thought about it for a few minutes, and then stopped, because thinking about it did not help anything, and made him feel considerably worse. Instead, he began working through the rest of the stack of intercepts on his desk, because the work did not stop and the stack did not get shorter by itself, and sitting still was not something his mind was good at even when his body was required to do it. He processed 7 more intercepts that morning. None of them were as significant as the one he had already acted on. 3 were routine patrol communications. 2 were logistical discussions that had no operational value. 1 was a fragment that was too corrupted to interpret. The 7th was a partial communication that referenced a location far to the north and which he flagged for the morning analyst. He worked through all of them carefully and logged each one. When the coffee finished brewing, he poured himself a cup and drank it standing at the edge of the tent, looking south, toward the direction where the vehicle had gone. He did not know what was happening out there. He knew what he hoped was happening. Daniel Weaver reached the edge of the marsh at 4:22 in the morning, according to the watch on his left wrist, which was the only timepiece he was carrying, and which he trusted completely, because it had never been wrong. He had driven south for 2 hours on tracks that were barely tracks, the kind of rural paths that appear on certain maps and then on the ground turn out to be suggestions, 2 lines through the dirt with grass growing between them, and enough soft spots to keep the driving from being automatic. He drove them at a speed that was deliberate and controlled and not fast, because a vehicle in trouble at 2 in the morning in the southern Iraqi lowlands was a problem that would not fix itself quickly. He left the vehicle at the place on the map he had pointed to in Fenton's office, parked it off the track and behind a low swell of ground that would not hide it from a deliberate search, but would hide it from a casual one. He pulled his kit from the back, checked it without a light, identified everything by feel, confirmed that he had what he needed, and left behind what he did not: his rifle, his ammunition, water, his radio, stripped to the essential components, nothing else. Then he walked. He walked south and slightly east, moving the way he had been trained to move in open terrain at night, which was with his weight back on each step until the ground told him where to put his foot next. The terrain changed every 50 meters or so, shifting from firm dust to softer compacted earth, to the kind of ground that had water underneath it, and let you know through the way it accepted your weight. He moved through 3 reed beds of varying density before the ground started getting consistently wet, and he understood that he was reaching the true edge of the marsh. He found the position in 20 minutes of searching, which was faster than he had expected. It was a building that had lost its eastern wall, either to age or to something more recent and more deliberate, the result being a stable remaining structure with a long open aperture facing the marsh, like a natural gun port in the side of a ship. The floor was mostly intact, though cracked. The walls were solid stone and not going anywhere. He checked the angles, confirmed the line of sight, checked what was behind him and above him, and verified there was nothing on the approach that could give him away. He settled into the corner, where the remaining north wall met the standing section of the east wall, found his position, adjusted it twice, confirmed it, and put his eye to the scope. The marsh was black. He began to wait. Waiting, for a sniper, is not a passive activity. It only looks that way from outside. Inside the wait, everything is active. The mind is working at full capacity, cataloging and updating and cross-referencing a continuous stream of information from the senses. The field of view through the scope contains dozens of data points at any given moment, each of which represents either a constant or a variable, and the job is to know which is which. The reeds move in the wind at a rate and pattern that, after an hour of watching, becomes a baseline. Anything that deviates from that baseline is a variable. A bird landing on the water and then lifting away fast is a variable. A change in surface ripple that does not match the wind direction is a variable. A flash of pale color at the wrong angle, in the wrong position, is a variable. Weaver established the baseline in 40 minutes. The marsh at night was not completely still. It had its own movement, its own sounds, its own rhythms, and by the time the sky had lightened from black to the first uncertain gray, he had all of those rhythms mapped in his head, with a completeness that came from sustained attention rather than effort. He had been in position for 3 hours and 20 minutes when he saw the patrol. The light was better by then, the pre-dawn gray giving way to the first pale wash of actual morning light. He had the scope to his eye, tracking slowly across the northern reed bed when the first figures appeared on the bank to the north. He counted 8, spread over approximately 200 meters of bank, moving in 2 distinct lines that were angled toward each other, converging on a point somewhere in the central section of the reed bed. The spacing was deliberate. The angle was deliberate. This was not a routine patrol doing a routine route. Someone had looked at a map and briefed these men on where to go and how to approach it. They were executing a plan, not following a habit. Weaver tracked the patrol through the scope and assessed the timing. At their current pace, the two lines would converge on the central channel in approximately 3 minutes, maybe a little more. His eye went to the channel. The surface was flat and unremarkable. Reeds on both sides, bending lightly in the wind. Nothing visible. Nothing that said there is a person in this water. But there was something. It was at the south end of the channel, where the reed beds narrowed to almost nothing on both sides. It was a disturbance in the surface pattern, a slight variation in the way the water moved, inconsistent with the wind and inconsistent with the current, which ran north to south in this section at a rate he had estimated through 4 hours of watching. The disturbance was small. It was the kind of thing that you would not notice at a glance, or in passing, or without context. It was the kind of thing you noticed after 4 hours of looking at the same water. Someone was in that channel. He could not confirm identity. He could not confirm status. What he could confirm was that someone was in the water in that location, and that 8 men with weapons were moving toward that location from 2 directions, and that at the rate they were moving he had roughly 2.5 minutes before the distance between those 2 facts collapsed to 0. He put the crosshairs on the leading figure of the northern line. His right hand moved to the grip and settled there, his trigger finger resting along the frame of the guard, and not on the trigger, because the decision had not been made yet. The decision lived in the space between the hand being in position and the finger making contact. And that space was the most important space that existed in this work, because once you left it you could not go back. He ran through it. He was not authorized to fire. He had been explicitly told, by a senior officer who had sent him here anyway, that he was going in without authorization to engage. He understood what that meant. He understood that firing without authorization in an active theater was a significant act with significant consequences, that the consequences would fall on him directly and entirely, and that there was no version of what he was considering that did not carry serious professional risk. He also understood that whoever was in that channel had approximately 2 minutes left before 8 men arrived at their position. He thought about the intercept. An asset may be compromised, written in pencil on a low-priority transcript. He thought about Fenton's face when he read that transcript, the stillness of it, the way a man looked when he was weighing something and had not yet landed on a side. He thought about the vehicle that Fenton had authorized, which was a vehicle for observation and nothing else, technically speaking. He thought about what observation would accomplish in the next 2 minutes. And the mathematics of the situation were very simple. Too simple to spend time on. The person in the water was about to be found. He was the only person within range who could change that outcome. The authorization for changing it did not exist. The outcome of not changing it was definite and imminent. Some decisions are not decisions in the ordinary sense. Some decisions are just the visible form of a calculation that has already resolved itself. His finger moved to the trigger. The first shot broke the silence of the marsh with a sound like a dry branch snapping underfoot, hard and brief and final. He worked through the next 5 in the space of 8 seconds, each shot placed with a precision that required him to be completely still and completely calm, which he was, because that was what this kind of training produced over years of repetition. Stillness and calm were not emotional states for him in these moments. They were technical conditions, the way a level surface is a technical condition for a piece of machinery that requires it. 6 shots total. 6. Through the scope he tracked the result of each one and confirmed what needed to be confirmed, and then shifted his attention to the 2 remaining figures on the southern bank, who had broken formation and were running south at full speed, abandoning the patrol and whatever plan it had been executing. He did not pursuing. Pursuing was not what the situation needed, and was not what he was there for. He lowered the rifle slightly, and kept his eye to the scope and watched the channel. For a long moment, nothing in the channel moved. Then a reed broke the surface. Not the reed itself, but the disturbance of someone taking hold of it. And then a head appeared above the waterline, barely, just eyes and forehead, turning slowly toward the east, toward the direction the shots had come from. Weaver watched the person assess. Watched the head turn south, then north, then west. Watched the calculation being made in real time. The same kind of fast, efficient calculation that people made when the situation had changed, and they needed to understand the new shape of it before they could move. Then the person in the water turned west and began moving through the reeds. Weaver watched until they were completely out of sight. Then he exhaled very slowly. He keyed his radio. He gave Fenton his position, the situation as he had just left it, and a single piece of information. There was a person coming out of the marsh at the western edge, identity unknown, moving west, and the extraction coordination for that sector needed to begin. Then he lowered the radio. He sat in the corner of the broken building for another 30 minutes, watching the marsh settle back into its regular rhythms. The wind moved the reeds. The surface of the water smoothed itself out. Birds returned to the southern end of the channel that had been empty for the past hour. The marsh resumed its ordinary appearance, which was the appearance of a place where nothing was happening, and nothing had happened, and nothing of significance had ever happened. It had always been this way. The marsh kept its own record in its own way, which was not a way that anyone looking down from above would be able to read. Weaver filed his position, confirmed the sightline one more time out of professional habit, and began preparing to move. Maria Espinosa had been underwater for 3 minutes and 44 seconds when the first shot reached her through the water. She heard it the way you hear sounds when you are submerged, which is as a flat, muffled pressure rather than a true sound. A single hard pulse that registered through the fluid, more than through the air, then the second pulse, then 3 more in rapid succession. Her lungs were at the edge of what she had been holding. The dark periphery of her vision had been gathering for the past 90 seconds, that specific narrowing that happens when the body begins to demand what the brain has been denying it. She had 17 seconds left in her count, maybe less. She surfaced. She did it with control. Face first, eyes before the rest of her, pulling one quiet breath before she allowed herself to register what she was seeing. The north bank was empty. The 2 converging arms of the patrol that had been closing on the channel were gone. Where 8 men had been moving in a deliberate pincer, there were now 2 men running south as fast as their legs would carry them, and no sign of the rest. She did not process this emotionally. There was not time for emotional processing in this moment, and it would not have helped anyway. She processed it operationally. The patrol was broken. The channel was clear. She had a window. She turned west, and she moved. She moved faster than she had moved in 11 days, but not carelessly, because carelessness and speed were 2 different things, and confusing them was how people made mistakes at critical moments. She moved with purpose through the reeds, pushing through the dense sections with her forearms, using the reed channels where they ran in her direction, staying low, staying quiet, covering the distance from the middle of the marsh to the western bank in 26 minutes. She came out of the water at a point sheltered by the curve of the bank, from the nearest observation angles she had identified in her first days in the marsh. She lay flat for 2 minutes, listening. Water sounds, reed sounds, bird sounds, which mattered, because birds were reliable indicators of whether large warm objects were nearby. Nothing unusual. She reached under her wetsuit and took out the notebook. She held it in both hands and checked every seal, running her thumbs around the edges of each layer of plastic, feeling for any compromise. The seals were intact. She pressed it back into position. Then she stood. She moved to the extraction point over the next 2 hours, covering the distance along the outer edge of the marsh, using the terrain for concealment where it offered concealment, and moving quickly across the sections where it did not. She thought about what had happened in the channel. 6 shots from a single position to the east, placed with a precision that spoke of a long setup time, a person who had been in position for hours, and who had had the distance and the angle and the patience to wait for the right moment. She thought about what that meant. It meant someone had been watching. It meant someone had known or suspected that the channel was in danger before the patrol arrived. It meant that the piece of information she carried pressed flat against her ribs had been deemed important enough, by someone, to place another person at range in a broken building, to watch over it without knowing exactly what it was. She did not know who 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 it was. Would find out later. She arrived at the extraction point at 2:17 in the morning. The boat appeared 7 minutes later, on time, running dark with its engine at low idle. 2 men in it. Neither of them were people she had met before. One of them handed her a blanket. The other turned the boat north and kept the throttle low. She sat in the back of the boat with the blanket around her shoulders and watched the marsh recede. It looked like nothing from out here. Just dark water and reeds and the sky above it, beginning its slow shift from deep black to something lighter. No sign of 11 days. No sign of mines or blocked channels, or an early morning patrol, or 6 shots from a position to the east. The water had already closed over all of it. She pressed the notebook flat against her ribs, through the blanket and the wetsuit and the layers of plastic, and held it there until she could not feel it anymore as a separate thing, until it felt like part of her own body. Then she let her head fall back and looked at the sky and let herself be finished. She slept for 8 hours in a small room that had 1 bunk and a metal chair, and a narrow window that looked out at a section of perimeter fence, and beyond it, the flat brown landscape of southern Iraq in early morning light. She did not dream, or if she dreamed she did not remember it, which was the same thing for practical purposes. When she woke, she was completely awake all at once, the way she had been waking for 11 days in the marsh, every sense engaged before she was fully conscious, her hand moving to the spot on her ribs where the notebook had been. It was not there. She had handed it over at midnight to a woman in a gray uniform who had a canvas bag and a receipt form, and who said thank you with the flat efficiency of someone who had handled these things many times, and understood that the formalities mattered, even when everyone in the room was exhausted. The notebook was in the system now. What happened to it from here was not her concern. She ate for an hour, powdered eggs, and something that had been bread recently, and coffee strong enough to re-establish the sensation of being a functioning person. She changed into borrowed clothes because her own were at the bottom of a laundry bag that was going through some process she did not want to think about. She showered for a length of time that she later could not estimate, because standing under hot water after 11 days in the Al-Hamar marshes was the kind of experience that briefly suspends your ability to track time. Then she was told there was a person she needed to meet. She was given a name and a rank, and a room number, and nothing else, which was standard. She found the room, which was a small briefing space with a folding table, and 4 chairs, and a map on the wall that did not show the area she had been in, and she pushed open the door. Daniel Weaver was sitting in one of the chairs, a metal cup of coffee on the table in front of him, looking at the middle distance with the same expression she had seen on a certain kind of highly trained person before, which was the expression of someone who was thinking intensely and had arranged their face to not show it. He was not what she had pictured. She was not sure what she had pictured. Exactly. Someone larger, perhaps. Someone who looked more like what the word sniper conjured when she thought about it. He looked instead like someone who might work in a technical field, who might be good with equipment, who would not draw any particular attention in a crowd. Which was, she understood, probably the point. But they shook hands. The handshake was 1.5 seconds, not more. The kind of handshake between 2 people who are meeting in a professional context and are both slightly wary of what the meeting means. They both sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet. A quiet with shape to it, the shape of 2 people deciding simultaneously how to begin. "Thank you," she said. Weaver nodded. He looked at the table. "I need to say something clearly," he said. "When I made the decision to engage, I had no identification of the asset in the water, no confirmation of status, no visual ID. I knew that someone was in that channel, and that the patrol was going to reach them. Those were the 2 facts I was working with. I know. I want you to understand that the decision was made without complete information, and I stand by it, and I accept every consequence it carries." She looked at him for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know exactly what happened on your behalf and why." She thought about that. 23 mines, she said. He looked up. "That's what was in the notebook. That's what you were watching over without knowing what it was." She held his gaze. "The engineering team got the data 2 hours ago. They're planning the clearance operation now. The corridor will be open in 72 hours, they estimate. Maybe 68. How long has it been blocked? 23 days. He was quiet for a moment. What's on the other side of it? Villages. Communities that haven't received supply convoys in 3 weeks. She paused. Medicine. Food. Water filtration equipment. Another pause. Children. Weaver looked at his coffee. He did not say anything for a while. The look on his face was not one that needed words, and she did not try to put words to it. "How did you know to be in position?" she said. He told her about Owen Price and the intercept, and the low priority flag, and the coordinates matching the log entry from 6 days earlier. He told her about Fenton's office, and the map, and the vehicle. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "A corporal doing routine review of a stack of low-priority intercepts pulled the one that mattered. At the right time. At exactly the right time." She sat back. "And you were already in place." "I had been in position for 4 hours before they showed up." She thought about that. 4 hours in a broken building, watching a patch of water, waiting for something that might not have come. The patience of it. The particular quality of attention required to watch the same water for 4 hours and still see the small thing when it appeared. "How far was the shot?" she said. 1,430 meters, roughly. I did not do the precise calculation at the time. In pre-dawn light. The light was better by then. First gray. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment. "I was running out of air," she said. "When you fired, I had maybe 15 seconds left of what I was holding." Weaver said nothing. "I don't mean that as a way of saying the timing was close," she said. "I mean it as information. So you know." He looked at her. Noted. They stayed in the room for another 25 minutes, covering the technical details of the operation and the morning's events. She described the patrol formation she had observed, the two-directional approach, the way they had moved with a specificity that suggested they had been briefed on the location rather than searching generally. He confirmed that their approach pattern matched what he had observed through the scope. They worked through the timeline together, placing each element in its correct sequence, confirming where the chain of events had held and where it had been close to failing. They did not discuss the moment itself, not directly. The moment existed in both their accounts as a gap that neither of them felt the need to fill, which was appropriate, because it had already said everything it needed to say. It was contained in the fact that she was sitting across from him in a chair drinking coffee, and the notebook was in the system. When the meeting ended, they stood at the same time and shook hands again, once, and she thanked him again, once, and he nodded again, and that was the end of the meeting. Before she went to the debrief room, Weaver went back to his unit. The formal report that Weaver filed that afternoon was 7 paragraphs long. Every paragraph was precise and factual, and contained nothing that was there for any purpose other than the accurate recording of events. He was not the kind of person who used reports to shape narratives. He used them to describe what had happened, and what he had decided and why. The 7th paragraph said, "I made the decision to engage without authorization. I made this decision on the basis of 2 confirmed facts, an imminent threat to a presumed Allied asset, and my position as the only person within range who could affect the outcome. I take full and sole responsibility for the decision, and for every consequence that follows from it. I offer no mitigation, and request none." Fenton read the report twice. He set it on his desk and looked at the wall for a moment, and then at the map, and then at the paperwork in front of him. He had been in this position before, not often, but enough times to have a way of moving through it. Some decisions in war were made correctly, and through the approved procedure. Some decisions in war were made correctly, and outside the approved procedure. The difference between those 2 categories was not the correctness of the decision. The difference was the sequence of paperwork that followed. He picked up a form and began filling it out. The reprimand took him 15 minutes. It was accurate and complete, and said exactly what needed to be said, which was that Sergeant Daniel Weaver had operated outside his authorized parameters in engaging an enemy patrol without prior approval from his commanding officer, and that this represented a violation of standing protocol that was documented here for the record. He signed it and put it face down on the desk. Then he picked up a different form and began filling out a different document. This one took him 2 hours, because recommendation documents of this kind required specificity, and he was committed to specificity. He described the conditions exactly, the intercept, the timeline, the position Weaver had established without being asked to, the 4 hours of observation, the assessment made with incomplete information in insufficient time, the outcome. He described the outcome carefully, because the outcome was inseparable from the decision, and the decision was inseparable from the outcome, and that inseparability was the whole point. He wrote, "Sergeant Weaver identified a threat to an Allied intelligence asset, with neither authorization nor confirmed identity of the asset. He established a position, observed for approximately 4 hours, and made a decision in the space of seconds that preserved the asset and the intelligence she carried. The intelligence in question directly enabled the clearance of a supply corridor that has been blocked for 23 days, restoring aid access to an estimated 40,000 civilians in the affected area. Sergeant Weaver's decision was made without authorization. It was the correct decision. These two things are both true and must both be recorded. He signed the recommendation. Then he put both documents in the same folder, and put the folder in a drawer, and locked the drawer. Some things needed to be kept together to be understood correctly. He believed that. Owen Price heard about the corridor clearance 3 days later, in a routine briefing summary distributed to intelligence personnel across the base. The summary was dense and covered a range of topics, and the corridor clearance was one paragraph among many, factual and without narrative detail, the kind of information that told you what had happened, without telling you anything about what it had cost to make it happen. He read the paragraph twice. Then he looked at the note he had written on the bottom of the low-priority intercept transcript, which he had kept in his own file because he had not been able to stop thinking about it. The note said, "Asset may be compromised." 3 words in pencil. The whole chain that followed, from Fenton's office to the vehicle to the broken building to 6 shots in the pre-dawn light, had started with those 3 words. He thought about that for a while. He thought about all the intercepts he had not looked at that morning, because he had been waiting for coffee. He thought about how many of those were still in the stack, flagged low priority, waiting for someone to read them. He thought about the particular way that the important thing often did not announce itself as important, that it sat in a stack looking identical to everything around it until someone turned it over. He thought about the fisherman whose son needed medicine, and whose neighbor's daughter needed clean water, and whose village had been waiting 23 days for trucks that had now arrived. He thought about how many steps there were between that boy and the transcript on his desk, and how many of those steps were invisible to the people taking them, and how many of those steps had been taken by people who did not know what the step they were taking would eventually connect to. He wrote in his personal log, "The important thing did not know it was important until someone treated it that way." He looked at that sentence for a while, then he closed the log. The first convoy moved through the corridor on a Thursday morning, in a light that was flat and bright the way the light was in the Iraqi lowlands in the hour after dawn, when the sun had cleared the horizon but had not yet built the heat that would come later, and flatten everything into a pale, exhausted stillness. There were 4 trucks. They moved in a line along the cleared water route, their engines low and steady, carrying between them an inventory that had been assembled and packed and repacked while the blockage was being calculated and argued over, and finally cleared. Food stores, 3 pallets of medical supplies including antibiotics, wound care materials, fever reducers, and a specific pediatric chest medication that had been on the priority list since the 2nd week of the blockage. 8 water filtration units, in flat boxes, stacked on the 3rd truck. A supply of fuel cells for the generators in the villages that had been rationing power since the grid had been unstable. It took the convoy 6 hours to reach the cluster of villages on the far side of the corridor. The roads on that end were poor, and the last section required slower driving, and the drivers were careful in the way that people were careful when they were carrying things that other people had been waiting a long time for. In the village where Abbas and his family lived, the convoy arrived in the early afternoon. The trucks came in from the north, along the unpaved road that ran beside the irrigation channel, and the sound of the engines reached the village before the trucks did, carrying ahead of them through the still air. People heard the engines and came out of their homes and stood at the edge of the road, and there was a moment before the trucks were visible when no one spoke, because they had been expecting this for 3 weeks, and the expectation had outlasted the certainty, and people do not speak in the moment before something they have stopped being sure would happen actually happens. Then the first truck came around the low curve, and the moment was over. People moved toward the trucks. The soldiers in the trucks came out and began the process of unloading and distributing, communicating across the language gap with gestures and patience, the universal logistics of getting things from a truck to the people who needed them. Abbas's youngest son received his medicine from the hands of a young soldier who looked no older than 20, and who said something in English that Abbas did not understand, but that conveyed very clearly, by the way the soldier's face worked when he said it, that he was glad to be there. His neighbor's daughter got one of the water filtration units, which her father set up in the courtyard that same afternoon, and by evening they had clean water running through it for the first time in 3 weeks. The other families received what they needed. The generators were refueled. The medical supplies were sorted and stored in the village's small clinic. That night, after the trucks had gone, and the village had settled into the quieter rhythm of an evening, after a long waiting had ended, Abbas sat at the low table in his home and told his children the story of the water woman. He told it the way he had heard it, keeping only the parts he was confident of, and leaving out the parts he was guessing at, which is the most honest way to tell a story about something you did not directly witness. A woman who had been in the water for many days. A woman who had done something in that water that had something to do with the blocked road, he believed, though he could not have explained the connection in precise terms to anyone who pressed him. A woman who had come out of the water when the thing was done, and gone somewhere he did not know. His oldest daughter asked, "Does she have a name?" He thought about it. In the versions of the story he had heard, she had several names, none of them her real one. The water woman, the marsh spirit, the one who swims at night, the mermaid. "I don't know her name," he said. "I don't think the story needs it." His youngest daughter, the one who had been following the story most closely, asked, "Is she still out there?" He thought about this question more carefully. "She is somewhere," he said, "doing something that needs to be done." And his youngest daughter went to sleep with that answer. And in her dream, the figure in the water was not frightening at all. She was not strange or ghostly or supernatural in any way. She was just a woman doing her work, in a place where the work was very difficult, and the darkness around her was not threatening, but simply the condition the work required. In the dream, the woman in the water was as ordinary as someone who worked in a field or behind a counter or in a classroom, ordinary in the way that most remarkable things are ordinary when you see them clearly enough. The girl woke up thinking that was exactly right. Weaver's Navy Cross was dated 6 weeks after the engagement. He received the reprimand 2 days before the recommendation was finalized. He read the reprimand, which was accurate, and which he had expected, and signed the acknowledgement form. 3 days later he received a message that the recommendation had been approved, and that a ceremony would be scheduled. The 2 documents were filed together. Everyone involved understood that this was appropriate, because both documents were accurate, and the fact that they were contradictory was not a defect but the precise description of what had happened. The ceremony was small. Fenton was there, and the commanding officer of Weaver's unit, and a few others who had been directly involved in the events the citation described. Weaver received the medal and shook the hands that were offered to him, and afterward, he stood outside for a while in the afternoon sun and thought about the gap between the citation's language and the actual experience of the morning it was describing. The citation was correct. It described the essential facts accurately, but it used the kind of language that citations used, which was precise and military, and which captured the external shape of events without quite reaching the inside of them. The inside of them was 4 hours lying in the corner of a broken building, watching a patch of dark water, not knowing who was in it or whether anyone was in it, waiting in a state of complete and sustained attention that was not comfortable and was not exciting, and had nothing in common with the way these things were usually described. The inside of them was the 12 seconds between the moment when the patrol reached the channel and the moment when his finger reached the trigger. The inside of them was the calculation done without paper in the space of a breath, the complete absence of authorization, and the complete clarity about what would happen without one. The inside of them was what it felt like to fire 6 times with an outcome you had no way to confirm, until a head surfaced at the edge of a reed bed and turned toward the east, and then turned away and began moving west through the water. He did not tell anyone what the inside of it felt like, because no one asked, and because it was not the kind of thing that benefited from being described to people who had not been there. It existed completely in the form it had taken, which was an outcome, a person out of the water, data in the system, a corridor cleared. He went back to his unit and continued his assignment, and did not think about the marsh again in any sustained way for several months, which was how he had always handled this kind of thing, which was to let it settle into its correct place in the long accumulated experience of the work, rather than hold it forward where it would get in the way. 4 years later, Owen Price left the Army and enrolled in a graduate program at a university in the Northeast. He had thought seriously about staying in the Army. He was good at the work. He had been promoted twice since his time at the Forward Operating Base. But something in him wanted to understand the larger shape of what he had been doing. Not just the individual work of it, but the theory of it. The way individual pieces of intelligence connected to each other and to outcomes. The way information moved through systems, and the way those systems succeeded and failed. He studied what he called operational intelligence history, which was not quite a standard field, but which several universities were willing to let him invent as a specialty, because his arguments for it were good, and his existing work was strong. He published his first academic paper 2 years into his graduate program. It was about a different operation entirely, a communications failure from an earlier conflict, but the argument inside it was continuous with what he would spend the rest of his career developing. The argument was this: the decisive moments in intelligence operations were almost never the moments that looked decisive from the outside. From the outside, the decisive moment looked like the action, the shot, the extraction, the convoy arriving. But those moments were the results of chains of smaller moments that were almost always invisible to the people not directly involved in them, and that were frequently invisible even to the people who were, because the people in those smaller moments did not know that they were in a decisive moment. They knew only that they were doing a specific job, and that the job required their full attention. And the corporal who read the transcript did not know it was a decisive moment. It was a transcript in a stack. He read it because it was in front of him, and because he had the habit of reading things that were in front of him. The decision to act on it was not heroic. It was professional. It was the result of training that had made a certain kind of attention so habitual that it operated even when the stakes were not yet visible. That was what he wanted to understand and describe, the way competence accumulates into outcome across the space between people who never meet each other. His third paper, published 15 years after his time in Iraq, was the longest and the most specific. It used a case study he described in structural terms only, without names or locations, covering the events in the Al-Hamar Marsh sector in enough detail to make the argument he wanted to make, but not in enough detail to compromise the operational security that still applied. He called the case study Convergence Without Coordination. He described 3 people who had never met each other, and whose individual actions had been legible only in isolation at the time they were taken, and who had together produced an outcome that none of them could have produced individually. He argued that this kind of result was not accidental, and not exceptional. He argued that it was a particular kind of success that well-designed systems reliably produced, and that the design feature required to produce it was not more procedure, but more capacity in individuals to act correctly, with incomplete information at the precise moment when action was required. The paper was accepted after 1 round of revisions. He received, among the responses to its publication, 1 email from an address he did not recognize. The email contained 1 paragraph. It said, "I was involved in the events you describe in the case study in the 4th section. You have not gotten all of the details right, because you could not have, but you have gotten the shape of it right. The shape is the part that matters. Thank you for putting it on the record." It was not signed. He read it 6 times over the course of the day. Then he wrote back, "I spent 15 years attempting to verify the full account and was not able to confirm all of it. I published it anyway because I believed the shape was true. I believe that the shape of a thing being accurately described is sometimes more important than every detail being verifiable, especially when the details that cannot be verified are the ones inside the decision, which no external record can contain." He added, "I hope the people involved are well." No reply came. He kept the email in a folder he labeled with a date. He looked at it occasionally, not often, but sometimes, when he was preparing to teach a seminar or working through a difficult section of an argument. He opened the folder and read the email again, and each time it confirmed the same thing it had confirmed the first time he read it, which was that the shape was right. Maria Espinosa completed her service and moved to a city on the coast. She had always been drawn to coast cities, not because of anything she could have articulated precisely, but because cities that faced the water had a particular quality, a certain openness in the air, a sense that the boundary between where you were and the larger world was permeable and near. She taught diving, It was a natural thing to do after the Navy, which was what she told people when they asked, and it was true enough that she did not feel any need to add to it. She had a studio near the waterfront where she ran recreational dive classes for beginners and intermediate students, and a certification that allowed her to run rescue training workshops for local emergency services when they needed refresher programs. She was good with students who were frightened of the water. She had expected this to be difficult, because her own relationship with water was extremely specific and had been shaped by experiences that were not average, and she was not sure those experiences translated into the ability to teach people who were frightened for much more ordinary reasons. It turned out they did. She knew exactly how to talk about fear in a way that made it manageable. She knew how to show people that the fear was made of specific things, each of which was smaller than it seemed when you examined it directly, instead of experiencing the whole mass of it at once. She had learned that in the marsh, not in a way she could have described at the time, but in a way that had settled into her and remained available. She did not talk about the marsh. This was not a complicated choice. There were documents that limited what she could say, but they were almost beside the point. The real reason was that the marsh was complete. It was finished and contained, and the thing it had been done for had happened, and the outcome was somewhere in the world being lived by people she had never met. It did not need to be talked about to remain real. Two things do not become more real by being discussed. She thought about it sometimes. Not often. She would be running a class in the water, watching a nervous student practice descending from the surface, and something in the angle of the light on the water, or the sound of the bubbles or some other quality of the moment, would produce a brief and complete image of the Alhambra marshes, and she would register it and let it pass. Or she would be driving along the coast in the early morning and see the water in the low pre-dawn light, flat and dark, and she would think for a moment about what was moving below it and what you could not see from above, and she would feel the truth of that in a way that was not uncomfortable. She had a nautical chart framed on the wall above her desk. It was an older chart, printed sometime in the early 1970s, before the marshes had changed significantly, before several decades of human intervention had altered the water patterns and the channels and the overall shape of the region. The chart showed the Alhambra marshes as they had been when she was in them, dense and wide and threaded with channels that had no coalition designations on any map that mattered. Most people who came to her apartment thought it was decorative, which was a reasonable assumption. It looked like a map that had been framed for aesthetic reasons, for the clean lines of it or the color, the way people frame old maps without any particular attachment to the geography they show. She did not explain to anyone why it was there. It was there because of what water looked like from above, on a chart, which was absolutely still, flat, featureless, giving away nothing. The chart showed water as a surface, as a color, as a space between the things that had names and elevations and defined edges. It showed water as the absence of land. She knew what was in that water. She knew exactly what was in that water, in those specific channels, on those specific early mornings in 2003, when the light came up flat and the patrols moved along the banks. And she knew that none of that knowledge was visible in the chart, that from above there was no record, that the water looked exactly as it had always looked and would always look, which was exactly like water. She thought that was approximately right. She thought that most of what mattered was like that. Most of the things that mattered happened below the surface of what you could see from a distance, in the specific details of specific moments, carried by specific people who were doing their job with their whole attention, at a moment when the job needed to be done. A corporal reading a stack of transcripts at 2 in the morning. A sniper lying in the corner of a broken building for 4 hours watching a patch of dark water. A diver pressed flat against the bottom of a marsh channel, counting to 300 with 17 seconds left. You could not see any of that from above. You could only see the outcome, and sometimes not even that. She had been the thing moving below the surface, and she had left the record of her movement in a notebook that had reached the engineers, and the engineers had used it, and the corridor had opened, and the convoy had come through, and somewhere a child had received medicine, and the medicine had worked, presumably, because medicine that reached people before it was too late usually worked if you got the timing right. She did not know the child's name. She had never been to the village. She had never seen the convoy arrive. She knew that it had. That was enough. Standing at her window in the early morning, looking at the water a few blocks east where the light was coming up, and the surface was that specific flat copper color that water turned before the sun fully cleared the horizon, she thought, that is enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly enough. It was the whole point.